The first Monday of retirement hit Thomas Grayson harder than he expected. For 40 years, his alarm clock had dictated his mornings, his calendar had been packed with meetings, and his phone had rarely stopped buzzing. But today, there was no alarm, no emails, no one waiting for his input. For the first time in decades, Thomas had complete freedom, and yet, he felt lost. He had spent his career leading teams, solving problems, and making an impact. But without his work, who was he? Many retirees lean on family, friends, or social groups to fill the void. But Thomas wanted something different. He wanted a life of purpose that didn't depend on anyone else. A life where he woke up every day with a sense of fulfillment, not just empty hours to fill. So, he set out to build exactly that. Thomas realized that purpose wasn't about being needed by others, it was about doing things that mattered to him. He made a list of everything he had once been passionate about but never had time for. Writing, woodworking, travel, and learning new skills topped the list. Instead of waiting for someone to join him, he took action. He signed up for an online history course, bought a set of carving tools, and dusted off his old travel journal. Purpose, he discovered, wasn't something you found, it was something you created. Without structure, days could slip by in a blur of television and idle scrolling. Thomas needed a reason to get out of bed each morning. So, he built a personal schedule, not one dictated by obligations, but one that gave his days meaning. Mornings were for learning and creative work. Afternoons were for physical activity, whether it was hiking a new trail or working in his garage. Evenings were for reflection, reading, journaling, and enjoying the quiet moments. With this balance, he didn't need others to fill his time. His days were already full, with himself. Thomas had always exercised casually, but now, he saw physical fitness as an investment in his future independence. He took up yoga, started cycling, and challenged himself with personal fitness goals. He wasn't doing it for anyone else's approval, just for the sheer joy of movement and strength. Instead of relying on social circles for validation, Thomas looked for ways to contribute meaningfully. He began mentoring young entrepreneurs online, not because he needed connection, but because he wanted to share his knowledge. He volunteered at a local nature reserve, spending quiet mornings tending to trails. Helping others gave his life depth, but it wasn't about filling a personal void, it was about making a real impact. At first, the silence of retirement had been unsettling. Now, Thomas embraced it. He learned to enjoy his own company, cooking meals just for himself, taking long solo road trips, and watching the stars without distraction. Loneliness, he realized, was not about being alone. It was about not knowing what to do with yourself. And now, he always had an answer. A year into retirement, Thomas was thriving. He wasn't waiting for others to give his days meaning. He had built a life that excited him, challenged him, and gave him purpose, all on his own terms. Because in the end, true fulfillment doesn't come from others. It comes from within. One morning, a year into his retirement, Thomas sat on his back porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. It was a simple ritual, but one that had come to define his mornings, a quiet reminder that life, even in stillness, was worth savoring. He had changed in ways he never expected. His days were no longer filled with obligations, yet they were fuller than ever. He wasn't just passing time, he was living it. But there was one more lesson he was about to learn. Thomas had always been a planner. Throughout his career, he had mapped out every step, every decision. Retirement had started the same way, structured, intentional. But one crisp autumn afternoon, something unexpected happened. He was hiking a familiar trail when he spotted an older man struggling with his camera, trying to capture the way the golden leaves reflected off the lake. Thomas, who had taken up photography over the past year, offered a few tips. The man, Richard, chuckled. "Guess I should have learned this years ago," he said. They ended up walking the trail together, talking about everything from travel to books to the best places to eat in town. Richard had retired 5 years earlier and had spent much of that time feeling lost, until he, like Thomas, decided to stop waiting for purpose and start creating it. As they parted ways, Richard said, "Maybe I'll see you here next week." Thomas smiled. He had spent a year proving to himself that he didn't need others to feel fulfilled. But that didn't mean he had to shut people out. Purpose was something he built on his own. But connection? That was something he could choose, on his own terms. Over the next few months, Thomas continued to explore life in new ways. He published his first travel essay online, sharing his solo road trip experiences. He started working on a woodworking project, a bench for his garden, where he often sat with a book and let the afternoons drift by. He and Richard met on the trails occasionally, exchanging stories but never depending on each other to enjoy the walk. Thomas also mentored a few young professionals, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. He had mastered the art of self-sufficiency. But now, he understood that independence and connection weren't opposites. They could coexist. As he sat on his newly finished garden bench one evening, watching the first stars appear, he realized something. Retirement wasn't the end of his story. It was simply the beginning of a new, self-written chapter, one of purpose, adventure, and balance. As winter settled in, Thomas found himself reflecting more deeply on what the future held. He had built a life of purpose without relying on anyone else, but now he was beginning to wonder, what would it look like to share his journey, not out of necessity, but out of choice? One evening, while browsing travel blogs, he came across an article about a retired couple who had converted a van and traveled across the country, documenting their experiences. The idea stirred something inside him. Thomas had always loved the road, but he had never considered making it a lifestyle. The next morning, over coffee, he made a decision. He would take his first long solo road trip, not just a weekend getaway, but a true journey. No fixed schedule. No reservations. Just the open road and the freedom to explore. He spent weeks preparing, outfitting his SUV for comfort, packing the essentials, his camera, notebooks, hiking gear, and a small collection of books. He mapped out a rough route through the Southwest, but he left plenty of room for detours. The day he left, standing by his packed car, he took a deep breath. This was different from anything he had done before. Not because he was alone, he had mastered solitude, but because he was stepping into the unknown without a plan. And it felt exhilarating. The first week on the road was a mix of excitement and adjustment. He drove through the rolling hills of Tennessee, camped by a quiet lake in Arkansas, and spent an afternoon wandering through a small-town bookstore in Texas. One evening, parked near a desert overlook in New Mexico, he met a retired artist named Linda. She had been traveling solo for years, selling her paintings at local markets and living out of a converted van. They shared a campfire and stories, and Thomas realized something. He wasn't the only one forging his own path. That night, as he journaled by lantern light, he wrote, "Life doesn't end at retirement. It expands, if you let it." As weeks turned into months, Thomas felt something shift inside him. He had once feared retirement would leave him aimless. Instead, he had never felt more alive. He hiked trails he never thought he'd see, wrote about his travels for an online magazine, and even tried his hand at painting after being inspired by Linda. Every new experience reinforced what he had learned. Purpose wasn't about filling time. It was about living with intention. And then, in a quiet coffee shop in Arizona, he met someone who would change everything. Her name was Claire. She was sitting by the window, sketching the mountains in her notebook. They struck up a conversation, and before he knew it, hours had passed. She had been on her own journey for years, traveling, learning, and embracing the same kind of freedom Thomas had come to love. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt something stir, not just excitement for the road ahead, but the possibility of sharing it with someone else. Thomas had set out to build a life of purpose without relying on anyone. He had done that. But now, he realized that independence didn't mean shutting people out. It meant being whole enough on his own to choose connection, not depend on it. As he and Claire planned to meet again in the next town, Thomas smiled to himself. Life, it seemed, still had plenty of surprises left. And he was ready for every single one of them. Thomas never thought a chance meeting in a small Arizona coffee shop would change the course of his journey, but life had a way of surprising him. He and Claire met again a week later, this time in Santa Fe. They spent the day exploring art galleries, sharing stories over street tacos, and wandering through the historic plaza as the sun cast golden hues over adobe buildings. What struck Thomas most was Claire's presence. She carried the same independent spirit he had worked so hard to cultivate. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her journey. She was simply enjoying the road, just like he was. As the evening wind grew crisp, Claire turned to him and smiled. So, where to next? It was a simple question, but it carried weight. For the first time in years, Thomas wasn't just thinking about his path, he was considering how it might intertwine with someone else's. That night, as he lay in his SUV under a blanket of stars, he realized something profound. He had spent the last year proving to himself that he could build a fulfilling life without relying on others. But now, he understood something even more important. Independence isn't about being alone. It's about having the freedom to choose how you share your time, and with whom. The next morning, he woke up with clarity. He didn't need to change his journey. He just needed to open himself to the idea that sometimes, the best adventures are the ones shared, not because you need to, but because you want to. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Claire traveled loosely together. Some days they drove separately and met at the next stop. Other days, they caravanned along the winding roads of the Southwest, swapping stories over crackling campfires. There were no expectations, no commitments, just two people who had built lives of purpose on their own and had chosen, for now, to share the road ahead. One evening, parked by a remote canyon in Utah, Thomas looked over at Claire sketching in her notebook. He smiled, feeling a sense of balance he hadn't known before. This wasn't dependence. It wasn't loneliness. It was something in between, a connection born from strength, not necessity. And as he sipped his coffee, watching the desert sky turn from pink to deep indigo, he knew one thing for sure. Retirement wasn't the end. It was simply a road still waiting to be explored. Months passed, and Thomas and Claire continued their travels, weaving in and out of each other's journeys like rivers converging and diverging. Some days, they traveled side by side, sharing campfires and quiet sunrises. Other times, they went their separate ways, each following their own curiosities before reuniting in the next town or at the next breathtaking view. One crisp morning in Montana, after a long hike through Glacier National Park, Thomas sat at their campsite, gazing at the horizon. He had thought retirement would be a time of settling down, but instead, it had become a time of expansion. Every mile on the road had revealed more of who he was, not just the man he had been in his working years, but the person he was still becoming. Claire walked over and handed him a steaming cup of coffee. "You've got that look again," she said with a smirk. "What look?" "The thinking too much look." He chuckled. "Just reflecting. It's funny. When I first retired, I thought I had to figure it all out. But maybe life isn't about having a final plan. Maybe it's just about choosing each day, one step at a time." Claire nodded. "Freedom isn't just about being on your own. It's about knowing you could be, but choosing when and how to share the road." Thomas took a sip of coffee, letting her words settle. He had spent so much time proving he didn't need anyone. But now, he understood, true independence wasn't about isolation. It was about being strong enough to choose connection without losing himself in it. As autumn turned to winter, they found themselves in a small coastal town in Oregon. The salty breeze, the crash of waves against the cliffs, it all felt like a place where something new could begin. One evening, as they sat by the fire outside a little seaside cabin they had rented for a week, Claire pulled out her sketchbook. "I think I might stay here a while," she said, tracing soft lines on the paper. "There's something about this place that makes me want to paint again." Thomas looked at the waves rolling in under the moonlight. He felt the same pull, but not to stop. The road was still calling him. The Oregon coastline disappeared in Thomas's rearview mirror as he headed south, the road stretching endlessly before him. The crisp morning air carried the scent of salt and pine, and with each mile, he felt lighter, not because he was leaving something behind, but because he was carrying everything he needed within him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. Not success. Not purpose. Not even a destination. He was simply being, moving forward because it felt right, not because he had to. Yet, as he drove through California's redwood forests and later camped under the vast desert skies of Nevada, he found himself thinking about Claire. Not with longing or regret, but with a quiet appreciation. Their paths had crossed at the perfect time, teaching him that true connection didn't require permanence. It could exist, thrive, and even evolve without expectation. Still, as much as he cherished solitude, he also realized something else. The road had given him so much, but it was time to start giving back. In a small Arizona town, Thomas came across a community center that ran programs for retirees who were searching for meaning after their careers. Curious, he attended a discussion group, listening to men and women talk about their struggles with identity, loneliness, and the uncertainty of what came next. He recognized their worries because he had lived them. He had sat in that same silence, wondering if the best parts of his life were behind him. By the end of the session, he found himself speaking up. "You don't have to have it all figured out," he told them. "I thought purpose was something you had to define before retirement. But I've learned it's something you build, day by day, choice by choice. And it doesn't have to look like anyone else's version of fulfillment." The room fell silent for a moment. Then, an older gentleman named Carl leaned forward and said, "So, what do you do now?" Thomas smiled. "I live." The group chuckled, but Carl nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what I need to do, too." By the time Thomas left that evening, something had shifted. He had spent so much time ensuring his life was meaningful, but maybe it was time to help others do the same. For the next few months, Thomas stayed in Arizona, leading small workshops and sharing his experiences. He helped others discover hobbies, create new routines, and reframe retirement not as an ending, but as an open road of possibility. Yet, despite finding a new rhythm, he never lost sight of what had drawn him to this life in the first place: the freedom to move, to explore, to embrace whatever came next. So, one morning, as he packed up his car once more, ready to hit the road again, he realized something. He wasn't just retired. He was alive. And there was still so much road left to travel. As Thomas drove eastward, watching the desert fade into rolling plains, he felt something different this time, a quiet knowing. Not a longing for what was next, not an urgency to keep moving, but a sense of completion. He had spent the past 2 years proving to himself that retirement wasn't an ending, but a beginning. He had built a life of purpose without relying on anyone, yet he had also learned the value of shared moments. He had embraced solitude, but he had never been alone. The road, the people he met, the experiences he had gathered, they had all been part of something greater. And now, for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to go home. Not to the house he had left behind years ago. That place no longer defined him. Home, he realized, was not a location. It was wherever he chose to be. And now, he wanted to be somewhere that reflected the person he had become. Months later, Thomas found himself in a small mountain town in Colorado, a place with crisp air, winding trails, and a community that valued creativity and independence. He bought a modest cabin overlooking a quiet valley, a place where he could wake up to golden sunrises and end his days watching the stars. He still traveled, still explored, but he no longer needed the road to feel free. He had carried the lesson with him. Purpose wasn't in constant motion. It wasn't in work, nor was it in waiting. It was in the way he chose to live every single day, with intention, curiosity, and gratitude. One evening, as he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, a familiar voice called out from the driveway. "Claire." She stood there, smiling, her own journey written in the sun-kissed lines of her face. "I was passing through," she said, "and I thought, maybe, I'd find you here." Thomas chuckled. "I guess life has a way of bringing people back together when the time is right." She nodded, stepping forward, the mountains stretching behind her, the sky open and endless. "So," she asked, "what's next?" Thomas leaned back, taking in the quiet beauty around him. "I don't know," he said with a smile. "But I'll figure it out, one step at a time." And with that, he knew, this was not the end of the road. It was simply a new way forward.